Hello and welcome back. Now we're ready to start learning a little bit more about the collision system in Unreal Engine. And in order to do that, I've created a collision tests or example project here with several scenarios laid out in these little frames. So what I'd like you to do is download this example project, unzip it, and open it up so that you can do these collision tests hands-on along with me in the videos. So if you haven't already, pause the video here and download and open the collision tests project. So the first thing we're going to look at when it comes to collision is a concept known as collision complexity. Now, all static meshes in a level have collision geometry. As we mentioned in our previous slide, to have collision, you need collision geometry, right? This mesh that we see right here, this demo display, has collision geometry. The Unreal Engine logo behind it has collision geometry, and so do all the other objects that we can see, at least most of them, they have collision geometry. Now, geometry for a static mesh asset comes in two types. We have complex and we have simple collision geometry. To showcase this, I'd like us to create a new piece of geometry, a new static mesh. We know that we can do so by going into our modeling mode, and under create, we have the option to create different types of meshes, right? Now I'm going to go into my content folder, into global, where we have a meshes folder for this project. And I'm going to make a new folder here. I'd like you to do this as well, called cone. And in the cone folder, let's just go into that folder and leave it there. And that way we can create a mesh and let it go straight into that folder by going down to new asset location and choosing current folder. Now we can create a new mesh and it will go into our cone folder. And as you probably guessed, we're going to make a cone. So I'm going to click on cone, and that way I can drag my mouse out and click to get a cone, and we can adjust the settings on the cone before actually creating it. I'm just going to take that height and bring it down to about 150, like so, and now I have a cone with the dimensions that we see here. So I can go ahead and click on accept and create that cone. Now that I have a cone, I can go back out of modeling mode into selection mode, and I can see my new mesh. It is a cone, and if I open my content drawer, it's right here in my new cone folder under global meshes cone, and I can rename it. I typically like to rename static meshes to SM underscore followed by what they're called. So I'm going to have an SM cone. Now that I have this static mesh, we can take a look at a static mesh's collision complexity property. We can do that by looking at the static mesh editor for this specific mesh. Now, we know that we can go to a static mesh in our content drawer, double click it, and get the static mesh editor that way. Another way is to find an instance of that static mesh. This is, of course, a static mesh actor with a static mesh component set to this particular static mesh. But anyway, we can select the static mesh actor. We don't want to have the static mesh component selected in the details panel, but rather the instance itself, this static mesh actor. We can right click on it and we can either browse to the asset or we can edit the SM cone static mesh directly. I'm going to choose that and open the static mesh editor for this cone. Now we can see the cone in the static mesh editor. Now, let's talk about the difference between simple geometry and complex geometry. If I go up to Show and check the checkbox next to Simple Collision, all of a sudden we can now see lines on our mesh showing polygons, specifically triangles. This is the triangle mesh. We often refer to this as the complex geometry of a mesh. Now, why is it showing me the complex geometry when I just selected Show Simple Collision? Well, because this mesh does not have a simple collision. It has a complex geometry only. It just has the triangle mesh. For that reason, this is what we get when we show the simple collision. And if we go to the Details panel and scroll down and find a property called Collision Complexity, we see that Collision Complexity is set to use complex collision as simple. So because this is the default setting, when we show simple collision, we're showing actually the complex collision because this mesh is set to use the complex collision as if it were simple collision. Now, because of that, this mesh will use its triangle mesh for collisions. For example, let's say that I put a sphere in the world and hover it right above this cone mesh and let it fall down onto the cone. Well, we happen to have a sphere under Global, Meshes, Sphere. Here we have a SM Sphere 30. That's because it's a sphere with a radius of 30. We can drag one of these in and get a static mesh actor and put it right here above our cone, maybe offset a bit so it doesn't fall exactly on the tip there. But we can hover it right above that cone there. And we can let gravity make this ball fall onto the cone by taking my new SM Sphere static mesh actor, selecting the static mesh component on it, and scrolling down to the physics section and checking simulate physics on it. And notice there's an enable gravity setting that's default set to true. That allows this object to participate in the physics system in Unreal Engine. So it's going to fall onto the cone. If I press play, we'll see that the ball falls and bounces off of the cone. It's bouncing off of the cone's complex collision because collision complexity for this cone static mesh is set to use complex collision as simple. The physics system is going to try to use the simple collision on a mesh, but with this setting, it's going to use that complex collision as if it were simple. Now, this is more computationally expensive on the machine, on the CPU, because there are more polygons, more triangles to perform collision calculations for. So in general, this is not really a practice that is used in serious games because it's not as performant. What's performant is to give this mesh a simple collision to use instead of complex. Now we can add a simplified collision volume to this. We've seen that we can go up to collision and add, let's say, a sphere or a capsule or a box. There's also other options here that give different types of collision. If we add one of these to our cone, now it's going to have two forms of collision. It's going to have its complex collision, the triangle mesh, as well as what we call a collision hull, H-U-L-L, collision hull. That's a simple collision. Let's just add a box simplified collision. So I'm going to choose Add Box Simplified Collision. You should now see a green box. It might be a little hard to see. If you want to get rid of that background there, you can go to Window and show Preview Scene Settings. If you check that and you go to Environment here, you can take the Show Environment checkbox and uncheck that and take the environment color and make it darker if you like that. That will allow you to see that box a little bit easier. You also don't have to show the floor. I'm going to get that back open here. Preview Scene Settings. I'm going to uncheck Show Floor there for a second, and we can see our mesh without a floor. I'm going to go ahead and get that floor back, though. But we can see the green box. This is the simple collision. And you can add more than one if you wanted. You could add multiple collision hulls to a single mesh. I'm just going to add the one, and I'm going to leave it at the box because, well, that's very obviously not the same dimensions as the cone, and that's going to allow us to see that difference very easily in the game. So now that we have a simple collision, well, we're still using complex collision as simple. And because our collision complexity is set to this setting, if I go back and drop that ball, it's going to still bounce off of the complex geometry of our cone, even though it now has a simple collision volume. It's not using it. It's using the complex as if it were the simple. If we wanted to use the simple only and not the complex collision, which is much more performant and the way that you should prefer, then we can change collision complexity to one of the other settings. Instead of use complex collision as simple, we can go to use simple collision as complex, or simple and complex. Either one of these would work, and we'll learn the difference between the two very shortly. But first I'm going to choose use simple collision as complex. Now we're going to use that simple box collision instead of the triangle mesh that makes up the cone. Let's see what happens if we go back and drop the ball onto our mesh. Look at that. We can now see that that ball has landed on that box collision, which doesn't look right, right? That's because our box collision is not appropriate for a cone mesh. We just chose it so that we can easily see the difference here. And it's painfully obvious that we're not using the triangle mesh, we're using a box collision shape. And if we want to see the collision volumes being used in our world, we can hit the tilde key to bring up that console command line and enter the console command show collision. If we enter show collision, well, we can now see the box that sphere is sitting on. It's landed on that simplified collision, that simple geometry for the cone. So collision complexity determines which of our geometries will be used, the complex or the simple. Now, if we're using simple collision as complex, we'll always get the simple collision. We'll never use the triangle mesh. But if we change this to simple and complex, well, now we can use both in different circumstances. Now, simple and complex is still going to use the simple collision for our physics interactions. If I press play, we can see that the ball still bounces off of the box simplified collision. So if it's simple and complex, well, what's using the complex collision? Because apparently physics still uses the simple one, right? Well, simple and complex allows us to optionally use that complex collision when it comes to making queries. Now, you don't know what queries are just yet. That's something we're going to learn about in the next video when we continue analyzing our collision complexity by introducing the concept of queries into our vocabulary. So stay tuned, and I'll see you in the next video.